We're not working. CEO for nothing. Welcome, everybody. I'm so pleased you all could join us. It's really a wonderful thing to see you all. Ramadan Mubarak, if anybody is celebrating. Happy Easter, happy Passover. There's so many spring holidays you all could be celebrating today. But I'm so glad that we're adding to the list a celebration of our democracy. And adding that to our spring tradition is a beautiful thing. I know many of you have been involved in local politics and local civic activities for a long time. And I want to tell you that we really appreciate that. We're so grateful that you are here in person or online. And I want to tell you, we have already gotten over 50 questions. I think the last count I saw was 59 questions from our neighbors and community members who really want our local government to work for us. It's really heartening to me how many people are in our community are engaged with choosing our elected representatives. And especially, I want to give a big shout out to those of you who don't work or study at UVA, coming onto grounds, coming onto this campus. I know it takes some time and effort, so I really, really appreciate you coming out as well. I am Angela Shaw. I'm the CEO and editor-in-chief of Charlottesville Tomorrow. I think we have some subscribers in the room. We were so pleased when students from UVA, interns, the Center for Politics, and the professor, Dr. Kara Onweli, approached us to ask them to partner with them to host this event. With our Democratic nominees who represent Charlottesville and Albemarle County. Charlottesville Tomorrow publishes a voter guide every year. The voter guide's real cool. It's very true. And this year, with this kind of partnership and with our growing organization, we really hope to make that voter guide the richest and most useful to you all it has ever been. We really want to help voters and stakeholders make important decisions with high quality information. We hope that you will continue to stay engaged in our local democratic institutions and subscribe. As subscribers, subscribe to Charlottesville Tomorrow. It's always free. And help us bridge our university lives and our community lives and understand each other better. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Please be aware that we are recording the video and audio of this event and streaming it on cbilltomorrow.org and on our YouTube channel. If you're watching online, welcome. You can submit your questions on our website, and but please do so soon. Because in the next 30 to 35 minutes, we're going to be sorting them and then asking them to answer as many of them as we can. But thank you again for coming, and I'll pass it over to Keone, who is graciously helping us to host this event.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us for the Mayoring First Forum between the Democratic states and the candidates for Virginia's 11th district. I'm Keone Vega, a first-year UVA and an intern at the Center for Politics. Our moderator this evenings are Irene Good, the Democracy Beat reporter at Charlottesville Tomorrow, and Eleanor Jenkins, a second year at UVA and an intern at the Center for Politics. Tonight's candidates are Senator Creigh Deeds and Delegate Sally Hudson. Virginia's 7th Senate District, 11 Democratic primary candidates. Senator Creigh Deeds served in the Virginia House of Delegates for nearly a decade before being elected to serve District 25 in the state Senate. Senator Deeds is a co-chair of the Judiciary Committee and serves on the Finance and Appropriations, Commerce and Labor, Rules, and Privileges and Election Committees. Senator Deeds also serves as chair of the Capital Outlay Subcommittee, chair of the Behavioral Health Commission, and chair on the Joint Commission on Administrative Rules. Delegate Sally Hudson was elected to the Virginia State House in 2019, making her the first woman to represent the 57th district in the Virginia House of Delegates. In the 2023 session, Delegate Hudson was a member on the House Committee on Health, Welfare and Institutions, and the Finance Committee. Previously, she served on the Agriculture, Chesapeake and Natural Resources Committee, and the Communications, Technology, and Innovation Committee. You all received a 3x5 card of questions as you arrived. If you have any questions for the candidates, please write them down during the middle of the program. Tim Wilson will come down the aisle and collect them and group them by themes. Our moderators will ask audience questions after our initial set of questions. As a reminder, voting in the primaries in Virginia begins on Friday, May 5th, in person at your local registrar's office. The last day to vote in the primary election is June 20th at your local polling location. To register to vote, update your local voter registration, or request an absentee ballot, visit vote.elections.virginia.gov/voter information. Please have a beverage or a snack, a t-shirt. Restrooms are located right outside of this room on either side. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming our moderators, Eileen Good, Eleanor Jenkins, and our candidates, Sally Hudson and Bree Deeds.
Hi, good evening. I'm Eileen Good. As has been mentioned, I'm the new democracy beat reporter at Charlottesville Tomorrow. Our goal is to make you more connected to your local politics and democracy than the regular kind of horse race coverage that you get. So you go in knowing exactly what you're voting for and who you're voting for. We thank the candidates very much for coming out and helping us with that goal and making time to interact with the community. Quick overview of the rules. Both candidates will be asked the same questions. We will alternate who responds first. They will get 3 minutes apiece to answer, and then they will each get 30 additional seconds. We will our timekeepers over here showing you time cards. We will hand off the questions between us, and Nora, I think you'll be telling the rest of the rules for this thing.
As was mentioned, Matus, one of those interns, is going to be having visual cues up in the front. The green card means that you're good on time. When the yellow card goes up, there's 30 seconds left. When the red card goes up, your timer's up, and we go on to the next response or the next question.
And we will stop you if you go over. It will be very, very polite, but it will still be engaged. So, do we have any, before we get started, Kevin, do you have any questions for us? Well, then we are going to throw out our first question. So you're going to ask you to respond first, you're going to respond second. So our third question, we're going to start with a very basic question tonight. Because we've heard this a lot from voters, we've asked for questions throughout the week. We've heard it in a lot of different ways. Legislatively, you're similar, you have similar political views. And honestly, you're at head-to-head face-up created by redistricting. So can you help our voters and viewers understand today how you're different from each other? What differentiates you?
Thanks so much for the question. And thank you all of you for making time for this tonight. We haven't had a chance to meet before. My name is Sally Hudson, and I've been serving Charlottesville and Albemarle County in the House of Delegates for the last 4 years. I was first elected in 2019, along with 10 other Democrats who flipped the House for the first time in a generation. And we started making progress on a long list of overdue priorities that had been bottlenecked for ages, from reproductive rights to clean energy to gun safety. As the first woman to serve Charlottesville in the Virginia House, I've been a champion for abortion rights. I helped make Virginia the safe haven for abortion access that we now enjoy today, and earned NARAL Virginia's Legislator of the Year award. I work to expand insurance coverage for abortion care. I know this community, this district in particular, cares deeply about protecting our planet. That's why I repealed Virginia's coal tax credits that have been propping up the fossil fuel industry and rerouted those resources to sustainable jobs. And I'm proud to be part of a new generation of legislators that have finally had the courage to start passing the gun safety laws that we desperately need. Amid all of that massive progress for Virginia, I have always kept this community priorities at the top of my list. This is one of the most affluent places in Virginia and also among the most deeply unequal. And I know there are a lot of people here tonight who want to make that right. And that's why I have always centered the financial challenges that Virginia families face in my work. I carry the legislation that created the new affordable housing incentives that are now in our new comprehensive plan. And when COVID hit and 1 in 6 Virginia workers found themselves filing for unemployment, I secured an extra $200 million in debt relief for those workers because unemployment insurance was the #1 reason my phone was ringing off the hook. I've secured $300 million in refunds from price gouging power companies because I know this community is ready for utilities to stop writing their own rules. And when patients in Central Virginia were being hounded by abusive medical debt collectors, I passed a bill to ban that practice statewide. I have always believed that the best work comes from the conversations I have every day with our constituents. Every single one of those projects did. And to do a job like that, I think you have to be an engaged, present member of this community. And that's why in this new election, with these brand new districts, the first in Virginia history that weren't drawn by the sitting politicians, I think our community has an opportunity to put those priorities first. For the last decade, we've had 2 state senators, both of whom were living almost 2 hours from where we're sitting right now. And I think that makes it harder to do the job the way I think it should be done. I think this district has a very special job to do. I think this district wants to set the pace for change on our priorities in Richmond. And I don't think that both candidates in this race have shared that particular vision.
Very nice. Sorry.
Just really quickly, so that the folks tuning in online can hear better, if you wouldn't mind holding when you speak. I'm sorry, the lapels are not picking up super well.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Creed Dees. I've been in the legislature a long time. And I'm proud to say that I'm one of the people that gets the most bills passed in the state. I'm one of the people that this year, and you don't have to take my word for any of this, but you can look it up. My record is long. My record I'm proud of. I've evolved on a whole lot of things. But this year and in previous years, I get more bills passed than anybody else. This year and in previous years, I've been voted the most progressive member or one of the most progressive members of the state Senate. You know, I get things done. I view the job of a legislator as the job is to make government work for the people I represent. Make government, make it relevant in people's lives. I think that government in general exists to serve the people. And so my focus is on solving problems. My focus is on making things work for people. And if you can look at my legislative history and you'll know that's true, whether it's passing bills that Charlottesville City Council asked me to introduce to affirm affordable housing legislation, or passing bills that bring down, when Charlottesville has the highest insurance rates in the country, introducing bills to bring to task the insurance companies who set those rates, or this year passing legislation that essentially brings to bear, gives people the right to fill propane tanks when their provider won't do the work. I've been about solving problems. I've been about getting things done, and that's the kind of legislator I'm going to be. You know, being an effective legislator is about 2 things. It's about seniority and it's about relationships. I build relationships, and so my record shows that I'm effective whether I'm in the minority or the majority. Obviously, more effective when I'm in the majority. But when I'm in the majority, if I'm returned, I will be no lower than the second-ranked highest Democrat in the legislature, in the Senate. I will be at least the chair of Judiciary Committee. I will be on the Budget Conference Committee. Listen to this. I'm the first member of the state Senate to represent Charlottesville since 1980 to be on the Senate Finance Committee. I'm on the Budget Conference Committee. I'm on the Capital Outlay Subcommittee, which is critical to our colleges and universities. I'm in a place where I can get things done, and I get things done. And that's why I'm asking for your support.
Sure, 30 seconds. Sure. I think it's important that you talk about the difference between seniority and leverage, because I think seniority and leverage are sometimes the change. How much can you use your position to get things done? I think what I've shown in the 4 years that I've been serving in the House is that even with no seniority at all, I have managed to push the pace on the priorities that this community holds most dear, including on a lot of problems that have been sitting on the back burner for the last 30 years, on confronting climate change and the pace the plan requires, on securing women's rights. And so I think you can get a lot done with very little seniority if you throw your weight around right.
But you have to be able to build relationships. She said introduced 40 bills in the last 2 years and got 2 of them passed. None this year. No bills this year. You know, I'm the one that has my name on the bills. I'm the one doing the work. I'm a workhorse. I'm not a show horse. You won't see me standing up and giving a lot of speeches because I don't need to. It's about getting things done. I get things done.
On to the next question. We received a lot of questions from Charlottesville Tomorrow's online forum about issues like critical race theory, trans rights, and school history curriculums. In what ways will you use the checks and balances powers of the General Assembly outlined in the Virginia State Constitution to ensure that education standards are inclusive?
Sure. Well, last year, we re-energized the Joint Commission on Administrative Rules. It was created in 2002 when Mark Warner was elected governor. The Republicans created it to try to keep check on him. They weren't very successful with it. He amended the bill, so it doesn't do what the Republicans intended to do, and that came back to bite us last year. I got elected as chair of the Joint Commission on Administrative Rules, and we had a hearing set in December for specifically for with respect to the governor's proposals to pull us out of Reggie administratively without going through the legislature, his proposals to and in fact, I think some of his proposals, his guidelines on the way he treats transgender children in school could drive some children to suicide. And on his proposals for history SOLs, they went through the history SOLs before the committee, before the meeting. We held the meeting within our constitutional bounds. We held with what we could do. We held the committee and rebuked the governor on Reggie, his proposals with respect to Reggie and his proposals with respect to trans kids. The unfortunate thing about it is that the Speaker of the House appoints the Republican members or the House members for the Joint Commission on Administrative Rules. So we're not able to do the same thing now for the history guidelines. So Sally and I both did what we could do, and that is go to the public hearing and express our lack of support, our dismay at the way that the SOL guidelines have been re-rigged by the Board of Education to reduce the whole story that the last Board of Education was trying to write into the SOLs. So we probably are going to need a House and a Senate and a governor to get the right things from the Board of Education. They've rigged the Board of Education. We pulled off one of the governor's appointees this time. We could pull off the others, but the reality is the governor is going to fill those slots. And we have no guarantee that he's going to fill them with people we agree with more. So we're probably going to have to wait for another trifecta to fix what's going on with the history standards.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Yes, so we received a lot of questions from Charlottesville Tomorrow's online forum about critical race theory, trans rights, and school history curriculum. In what ways will you use the checks and balances powers of the General Assembly outlined in the Virginia State Constitution to ensure that education standards are inclusive?
I appreciate the question, and that assumes that we're currently following the Constitution. We are on the rails in Virginia, and I want to explain how we got here. In January of 2022, when Governor Youngkin was sworn in, he was supposed to carry over 3 nominees that Governor Northam had appointed to the Board of Education. The boards and commissions that govern Virginia are supposed to work like that. Each governor gets some appointees. And as Governor Youngkin starts up his term, some of the appointees from Governor Northam carry over, and over time, each governor refreshes the boards with their new appointees. Governor Youngkin did something unprecedented in response to a decision by the Senate Democrats to remove the appointee to the Secretary of Natural Resources from Governor Youngkin. Governor Youngkin struck 3 members from the Virginia Board of Education. They included a man who had just won the Teacher of the Year Award, a woman who had just won Superintendent of the Year Award, and another 40-year educator who had also been the superintendent. He removed Governor Northam's appointee to the Board of Education for the sole purpose of packing him with his selected members so that we could fast track exactly the problems that you're describing, the revision of the model standards for trans students and also the standards of learning for history. If Governor Northam's appointees had been appointed when they were, we would have passed new history standards last August and we wouldn't be in this mess. So what do we do about it? The next thing that we can do is to wait till we get Democrats back in the House and the Senate, where we have more control over who fills those spots. But Senator Denise says the reality is the governor gets to make those appointments. And so it is very difficult for us to do much more than rally public support against those standards. But I want to be very clear that everybody who has raised your voice to rally support is doing something that matters. Because as those standards have been made public every single iteration this fall, we have seen revisions in response. And so it's not like public outcry doesn't do anything. And we have seen in particular that in swing seats where the governor is trying to win re-election for his members of the House and the Senate, going after public education when it really comes to gutting the rigor of the schooling that students get is not a winning issue. And so everybody has an obligation to raise their voice on this.
Would you like to respond, Senator Deeds?
Delegate Hudson is correct. I don't regret, I was chairman of the Privileges and Elections Committee at the time, and I don't regret the fact that we pulled Andrew Wheeler's name from the nominations. He was not fit to be Virginia's Secretary of Natural Resources. But the cost we paid, every year, the appointments that the governor makes after the legislative session through the end of the year are on a resolution that has to be confirmed by the General Assembly. They did jerk us around on that resolution, and that costs us.
Sure, I want to follow up with the fact that Andrew Wheeler is still working for the governor. So the symbolic gesture of blocking him from being Secretary of Natural Resources did nothing to protect the people of Virginia. I also want to respond very quickly to something that Senator Deeds said. He's a member of the majority in the Senate. I'm a member of the minority in the House. When I pass bills, I pass them with Republicans. It means you have to put your name as second fiddle on the list. Who cares who gets the credit? All I care is getting work done for this community.
Moving on to the next question. Charlottesville has been devastated by rising levels of gun-related homicides. What programs do you support funding to reduce shootings and mitigate their worst effects? Starting with you, Delegate Hudson.
We'll share. So let me start by talking about the valuable progress that we have shown we can make when we elect courageous legislators that we did in the 2 years when I was serving in the majority. I want to talk about the opportunities that we missed, and then I think where we have to go from here. 2020 was a sea change in how we do gun safety policy in Virginia. We finally started passing a host of laws that had been sitting on the back burner for forever. We passed universal background checks. We closed the Charleston loophole that allowed the Charleston shooter to run out the clock on his background check. We created extreme risk protection orders or red flag laws, which allow people to identify someone they know who has made a credible threat that they're going to hurt somebody, themselves or others. We banned people with a history of domestic violence or hate crimes from owning weapons anymore. Those are such strong precursors of future violence. We finally banned buying more than one handgun a month in Virginia, which was a law that you had crossed party lines and voted to repeal in the 10 years before. That's what created Virginia as a gun runner state, made it so easy for there to be so many cheap firearms on our streets, which are now part of that rise in gun violence. So we got a lot of good work done, but we also fell short on some important measures. We failed to pass an assault weapons ban because we had conservative senators in the state Senate who crossed party lines to vote that down, even though we had passed it through the House, even though it had the full support of Governor Northam and Attorney General Mark Herring. We failed to pass a bill that would have held grown-ups accountable when they recklessly leave a firearm around a teenager, because that was another bill that we had conservative Democrats in the Senate vote down. So there were more things that we could have done. But I want to be clear that there's only so much that we can ban the kind of gun violence that we're seeing in our community. As I think your question suggests, some of it requires proactive investment in community institutions that will prevent violence and aggression before it starts. When I talk to people in this community all the time, I hear them rattle off the opportunities for youth that were available when they were growing up or when they were raising their kids that aren't there anymore, being able to swim or play basketball at the rec center for free. I know there are communities across the country that have helped mitigate gun violence by having publicly funded job opportunities for kids in the summer. So you've got kids not just staying busy, but building skills and communities and a strong sense of the future. I think we really have to reckon with the fact that youth today have seen so much of their expectations about safety and stability shattered in the pandemic. I don't think we can possibly blame them for being uncertain about what comes next and who's taking care of them. And so while I think there is some work that we can do in the state legislature, I think ultimately, until we are putting our money where our mouth is and making other opportunities for people to have strong connections to their community, I don't think we're going to see a long-term solution to the most common gun violence that we've seen here in Charlottesville.
I grew up way out in the country. I grew up on a farm. probably learned to shoot a rifle about the time I learned to read. I grew up hunting, and I grew up, I can't apologize for that. I'm not going to. In April of 2007, before I was elected to the state senate, I was elected to a House district that stretched from Bath County to Blacksburg. So I'd run for office down there. In April of 2007, I was sitting in a restaurant, looking over the bar at the television, watching the campus that I knew, watching a shooting that occurred there in the aftermath. I was down there the next day for the Convocation Center, and I'll tell you that event changed my whole life and my whole relationship to firearms. I worked with the family groups afterwards to change the gun show, to close the gun show loophole. That's basically the universal background check, and we didn't get that passed until 2020. Delegate Hudson's correct. We got a bunch of stuff passed in 2020. The assault weapon bill we passed. Besides, being a legislator is a full-time responsibility, but it's only a part-time job. I'm a lawyer. I've been a lawyer for 39 years. And that was not a constitutional bill. Whatever we pass, we have to think about whether it's going to be held up in court. The last thing I want to do is tell people we're passing something, we're doing something, and not really doing it. So what I did this year, we sent that bill to the Crime Commission. The Crime Commission was controlled by the House Democrats, and we asked them to fix it. They didn't do it. So what I did was I looked at the most successful assault weapons type ban that had existed in this country, the one that was in effect from 1994 to 2004 at the federal level. I used a definition from that bill and introduced legislation that wrapped around that this year. I got it out of the Senate with Republican votes and Democratic votes. It died in the House of Delegates. There are lots of things we can do. There are lots of things we can do with firearms, but I think your specific question was, what can we fund? We can fund things like the Buck Squad. We can fund things that are community interceptors or interventionists. We can fund things that not only programs to give our youth something to do. I mean, the chief of police tells me that what's going on right now is young people are settling disputes with firearms. In the old days, they settled disputes with fists. We have to intervene with kids, but we also have to intervene by putting more people on the street. And groups like the Buck Squad are exactly the kind of interveners we need.
Delegate Hudson, do you wish to respond?
I am all for public servants evolving on issues over the course of their career. I think it's important that we all learn and grow. I think it's important that we all listen. But it would mean more to me if you were willing to talk more openly about your transition on gun safety issues, because the truth is that you have been casting conservative votes on guns since long after the Virginia Tech. And I think if we're going to bring more people along on the path that you have navigated in recent years, in part in response to this competitive election, it would be better if we could talk openly about what got us there.
I don't see the world as a bright line conservative and liberal. I think with the bills that are introduced in the General Assembly, you have to consider everyone on its own merits. You have to consider legislation for its purpose and for the way it's written. You've got to figure out whether it achieves the goal that it sets forth and whether it's going to work under our framework of constitutional law. And that's what I've tried to do as a legislator. That's what I've tried to do as a person.
Thank you very much. I just want to remind everybody watching online and here, if you would like to ask questions to our candidates who are good enough to come out tonight, please get them written down. We're going to start organizing them in a few minutes so that we can ask the second program. Next question. Charlottesville has started a long overdue rehabilitation of Buford Middle School and Walker Upper Elementary School. The city is struggling to fund that project since the state denied its request to impose sales tax. What can you do to provide state level assistance to this very overdue project?
I think it's my question. what we tried to do, both of us last year, was legislation to allow the city of Charlottesville to impose a sales tax increase. I got my bill out of the Senate. We got it out of the Senate with bipartisan support, frankly, because there are Republicans that support this legislation. There are Democrats that support it. It died in the Senate, in the subcommittee, in the Senate Finance Committee or the House Finance Committee. This year, what I did was I took the bill and included it. Charlottesville and Albemarle. Albemarle requested the authority too and got it out of the Senate. It died over in the House subcommittee just as it did before. But what we did was something different. And Jennifer McClellan, good friend of mine who's now in Congress, had a broader bill to give every locality in the state the ability to raise their sales tax by 1 cent to fund school construction projects. We took that broader bill and put it in the budget. So it's still subject to the negotiations as we meander our way through the various topics that are tied up in the budget. I'm committed to getting that done. I mean, we frankly, I would prefer for the state to come up with a reliable source of funding. There are some localities in the state that simply don't have the ability to raise the money through sales tax. They don't have the tax base, the revenue, the retail base to generate sales tax to fund substantial school construction. But, I thought that about Halifax County, and Halifax County is now building a new high school with the sales tax money they've generated. So I would rather come up with a state source of funding for this. But this is an authority that every locality ought to be given, and I'm not giving up on it even this year. I think we still have a chance to get it in the budget.
So I think Senator Deeds gave an accurate accounting of the bills from the last 2 years. Let me highlight, I think, 2 lessons that emerged from that. One is the Senate is a much more bipartisan body than the House. And both of us have met that bill dead on arrival in a House subcommittee. It's one of the realities. There's nothing especially special about getting things out of the Senate on a bipartisan basis. It's a much more doable thing. The House is a more rabidly partisan place. But I do think, since we've already covered the basics of where the bills have gone for the last 2 years, I want to pick up where Senator Deeds left off, which is what we really need to confront our problem with school construction for the long haul, because the State Commission on School Modernization and Rehabilitation has put the price tag of upgrading our schools at about $25 billion. More than half of Virginia schools are more than 50 years old, and there is no way to do that without a serious source of state revenue. And that work awaits the next Democratic governor. And we have got to send people into the state Senate who are going to be partners with him or her, God willing, on the next major tax reform, because we haven't done it in Virginia since Mark Warner was governor. And that's exactly the kind of work that I would be excited to lead in Virginia in the Senate, not just to support, but to steer. I'm the only economist in the General Assembly. There's a lot that we can do with our state tax code if we send people in who are equipped to handle the nuts and bolts of that work. And so I think, though we're in our current partisan environment, sort of stuck on the particular form of school sales tax funding that we'd like to secure for now, absent this budget approach. I do think that in the long haul, we've got to be looking at serious tax reform in Virginia. And that's really what's going to get us to a place where all of the districts, not just here, not just from this one approach, are in a position to fund the school renovations they need.
The serious tax reform, the governor, one of the hang up in the budget this year is the governor wants to do $1 billion in tax cuts, about half of that or a bunch of that for a corporate tax cut. And we've said no in the Senate of Virginia. We would rather invest that money in our priorities. We have K through 12 and mental health primarily. But the reality is, twice in Virginia history, in the 50s and then in the late 90s, did we use state money for school construction. In the late 90s, my predecessor, Emily Kurek, was the catalyst to get that done. And we haven't forgotten that. We need to do more work to fund school construction.
Wish to respond, Delegate Hudson? Moving on to the next question then. Charlottesville is limited when it comes to affordable housing due to rising real estate costs and current zoning laws. We're currently on UVA grounds where employees, contractors, and some students struggle to find housing that they can afford. We received one question from a voter about seniors on fixed incomes who are also struggling. What will you do to increase funding for the Virginia Housing Trust Fund and ensure affordable housing for all residents of District 11? Starting with you, Delegate Hudson.
Affordable housing is priority 1, 2, and 3 when I'm out talking to residents of this district, and it's why I've put so much work into it over the years. Let me talk about what I've done in the past that we're now going to see roll out in the coming months, and then particularly how we can go after funding for the Virginia Housing Trust Fund. In 2020, I carried a bill that is now starting to bear fruit in the affordable housing incentives that are in the new comprehensive plan. This was a bill that specifically carved Charlottesville out of statewide standards for affordable housing incentives, because I could tell that other legislators wanted to set state standards so there were consistent standards for home builders statewide, and they weren't going to be aggressive enough for the scale of the investment that we needed in this community. So I worked in a special bill to carve Charlottesville out of that system so that we would have full flexibility to set our own new standards. Here's what they're going to be. When the new comprehensive plan goes into place, any building with more than 10 units has to have 10% of those units reserved for people with less than 60% AMI. If they reserve those units for less than 50% AMI, the builder would get a 2-story bonus. And if 100% of the units are affordable, like the kind of construction that Habitat does, then they can put twice as many units on the lot than it would otherwise be zoned for. Those are very concrete, deliverable actions that are going to facilitate affordable housing construction in the days going forward. I have also passed legislation to streamline the redevelopment of public housing units. If you've seen the developments on Crescent Halls and South First Street and soon on Hardy Drive, that's also an important part of our affordable housing stock, those permanently subsidized units. And during the COVID crisis, I passed legislation to protect tenants from illegal evictions, because it really doesn't matter what our affordable housing laws are if the penalties aren't strong enough to enforce them. That's the work that I have done on affordable housing. You specifically asked, though, about funding for the Virginia Housing Trust Fund, because we can incentivize the construction of new units, but there are some people who are going to need permanently subsidized units, even after they're built. People with disabilities, people with substance abuse challenges, people suffering from behavioral health disorders. And right now, the amount of money that we're putting in the Virginia Housing Trust Fund is wildly out of scale with the need. It was a really big deal in 2020 when Governor Northam, for the first time in history, put $10 million a year in the budget for the Housing Trust Fund. That year, I went up to the Secretary of DHCD and said, that doesn't sound like enough. How much do you actually need to start making a dent in the shortage of the 300,000 units we're missing statewide? And they told me about $500 million. That's how wildly out of scale we are with our current investments. That's why it's such a terrible proposal that this governor wants another $1 billion in tax cuts, if what we need is $500 million in investments in the Virginia Housing Trust Fund. That's the scale of the problem. We won't solve it until we talk about it like that.
Housing is a huge issue. You know, we have a federal system of government in this country. There at every level of government, national, state, and local, there are things we can do. National policy on housing is run through HUD, and certainly they run some programs. Most decisions are going to be made at the local level because their zoning and their building permit process, most of that's going to be local, so that it's nuts and bolts politics. What the state can do is provide more funding for things like through the Housing Trust Fund. And what I've supported in the past, and what I would support again, is that we tag some money, like a portion of the recording tax for every transaction, so that you have a permanent source of revenue that goes in, a stable source of revenue that goes into the Housing Trust Fund. You know, the Housing Trust Fund is one thing we can do. We've also, you know, and this has come primarily through the work of the Behavioral Health Commission and the Joint Commission on Mental Health, to study mental health. We've put $42 million a year in long-term supportive housing. Now that only creates about 2,400 slots statewide, because long-term supportive housing, you know, what the evidence is overwhelming that people who have serious mental illnesses, the best chance for them to have long-term stability and success in life, and everybody deserves the chance of success, is for them to have a place to go that's not time limited and support when they live there. It's a very expensive process. This year, and part of the budget negotiation we're going through right now, we've got another $50 million in long-term supportive housing. It only creates about 3,000 slots. So it's one of those problems that it's like a well that has no bottom. But every investment you make is incredibly important and incredibly worthwhile because you're changing a person's life. And we have to continue to make those kind of investments. So I would support continuing to put money into long-term supportive housing. I would support coming up with a fixed source of revenue for the housing trust fund. And I think we can do that through the recording tax. Or I think that's what makes the most logical sense.
Okay, Hudson, do you wish to respond?
I think the last thing that I would add is there are lots of places where I think there's a lot of scope for bipartisan work on this. I worked really closely with Republicans in this region, in Nelson County Board and further down, because a lot of us want more construction in our communities. And it's where I think we have a lot of potential to bridge urban and rural divides, because they're facing the same challenges we are in terms of revenue for school construction and a shortage of affordable housing. And so if you're feeling sort of down on bipartisanship, I think housing is a place where we can really come together.
Dietz, do you wish to respond?
Thank you very much. And this will be our last question in this section of the evening. We heard a lot about this week in our questions from community members. The General Assembly has already passed legislation that allows local governments to use ranked choice voting, where voters are picking candidates in order instead of just picking one. Will you encourage the use of ranked choice voting, and how? And are there other election reforms that
Sure. As chairman of the Privileged Elections Committee, I either carried or shepherded through a bunch of legislation that made our state among the national leaders in access to the ballot. The whole idea is it ought to be easy for people to vote. And so now we have 45 days and no excuse absentee voting, 45 days where you can vote in person. We did so much that the drop boxes, we did a whole lot towards making the ballot easier. In 2017, I carried the first legislation in Virginia to create same-day registration. I went to a national meeting and saw that Utah had same-day registration. I figured if Utah can do it, Virginia can do it. And so now we have same-day voter registration. It took several years. When the Republicans controlled the legislature, they wouldn't let that bill out of committee. When in 2020, I guess, before the General Assembly started, I sat down with the head of the ACLU and kind of figured out where that legislation what it ought to look like. And that's the same day registration that passed. I carried a bill this year. The Republicans in 2021 had a ranked choice process for the nomination of the governor. They were afraid that Amanda Chase would win a primary, and she may have, and that would have been a wonderful thing. But we use primaries. We don't use a party run process. So I carried a bill this year that would have allowed the Democratic Party to choose a same day or choose a ranked choice process for the nomination of candidates. The head of the State Board of Elections, the State Department of Elections, came to me and said, we can't do that. And I said, pardon me. And she said, there are only two states in the country that do ranked choice primaries, Maine and Alaska. And they only have one type of voting machine allowable in those states. We have 4 different types of voting machines among our localities. You got to remember, the localities aren't national, or the elections aren't national, they aren't state, they're really local run elections. And so I punted on that idea, but I intend to reintroduce that bill. I think it's a good idea. I've asked the State Board of Elections, the State Department of Elections to go to the drawing board and figure out how to get it done so we can make it work next year.
I carried the legislation that you described that made ranked choice voting possible in Virginia for the first time. And I carried the only legislation on ranked choice voting this year that was endorsed by the Virginia Registrars Association, because I'm the only legislator who has been working with the Virginia Registrars Association on the ranked choice voting legislation. For the last 3 years, I've been leading a work group between state registrars and the Department of Elect and our local registrars on ranked choice voting legislation. You could have come anytime you wanted, but you didn't. You didn't even ask me about the bill that you introduced on ranked choice voting that the Commissioner of Elections asked you to pull because we weren't ready to introduce it. I could have told you that that wasn't the appropriate next step in ranked choice voting adoption in Virginia, because I was carrying the bill that was endorsed by the Virginia Registrars Association for the next step incremental expansion of ranked choice voting in Virginia, which is to bring in school boards and constitutional officers. We do have a lot of work to put ourselves in a position to be more like Maine and Alaska. It comes from the adoption of local pilots. Arlington County is the first county to take advantage of the legislation that I passed in 2020. I have given multiple presentations to our county boards and our city council about what the next step could look like here. Because we have different voting machines, as you mentioned, than Arlington County, Charlottesville City will not be in a position to adopt until November of this year. But if you're excited about ranked choice, whether you live in the city or the county, I hope you leave here today and you tell your city councilor or your county board member that you would like us to adopt, because we do now have that legal authority. And come November, we would be able to adopt. It's because we now have the software in place to do it. So there is important work that we can do on ranked choice voting. It takes a lot of careful work and bringing all those important stakeholders to the table. I will say I haven't seen you introduce ranked choice legislation until you found yourself in a competitive election with me. It's something that I've been working on now for 5 years. I think it's really important. I think it's one of the most concrete things that we can do to restore some sanity to politics. But it's not just a big idea. It's something that we have to work on the technical implementation of if we want to get it right. And I'm happy to talk with anybody about the nuts and bolts of that.
As I said at the beginning, getting things done in the legislature, a lot of it's about building relationships. I'm sorry you couldn't feel like you could come talk to me and tell me about these problems that you saw in the legislation. You know, your friends are the ones that asked me to introduce the bill. I introduced the bill, and then I talked to the head of the Board of Elections, and I pulled the bill.
I carried the only ranked choice voting legislation that was endorsed by the Virginia Registrars Association because I was working side by side with them on the project.
That is this section of the evening. I think we'll take a 5-minute intermission so we can collect the cards, and then we will start up with the questions again. So talk politely among yourselves.
Yeah, my family friend.
We're not.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, that's.
Democrats.
Like really hard. Me too. Fine, that's on.
For elected.
Yes. Just like showed up at your house. She actually was fairly. Yeah, it's Congratulations, say hello. Right for dinner. Yeah. Yeah, it's like, hey, Rob. It would be. That's me. There. With the. That one is hanging.
Take our seats so we can start this party up again. Right, everybody has their snack. So we are all going to sit quietly, drink our tea, and we are opening up the part of the debate that is the questions that came directly from the floor. We will ask as many of these to the candidates. 25 or so minutes. And you know, if they want to. You talk the answers, so we can ask for that. It's completely up to them. But we are not encouraging. So here's our first question. We've heard this a few times. We've been talking questions throughout the week. And this is about the redistricting and how it affected the Democratic. So you actually had to move to stay in the Charlotte district. And how did you already, you know, the Senate instead of the House, giving up your seat there? So starting with you, Senator, can you tell the people of District 11 why you made the choices you made And how it can advance the issues they care about here in this area.
Sure. You know, I will tell you the truth. I've been doing this work for a long time. 32 years I've been in the legislature. I'm tired of the politics, but I enjoy the work. The work is, I found meaning in it. You know, and I've got things I'm in the middle of that I'm not ready to let go of. There's still work that I care about that I'm doing. I've represented Charlottesville and Albemarle County, Nelson County since December of 2001. I've spent probably as much time here as I've spent in Bath County. You know, you got to remember, I ran for statewide office twice. Bath County's not in the middle of anything. It's on the West Virginia line. I spent almost 90% of the nights in the years from 2004 to 2009 outside of my home. And since then, I've spent probably half the time outside of Bath County. I've lived in Charlottesville full time since September of last year. I moved because I've still got things to do. I've still got service to give. And I moved because I still care about this community. I care about the work, and I want to offer myself up for reelection. But ultimately, it's up to the people to choose. It's not up to me. And I accept that.
What part was the question for me? I'm sorry.
The question is about talk about redistricting and what you bring to the table.
Sure. I mean, I think that's what I tried to talk about in my introductory question.
You left the house now, you're running for the
Sure.
Senate. That's the change you're making.
Sure. I'd like to talk about, why I'm running for the Senate right now. I think that this election presents an extraordinary opportunity for generational turnover in the General Assembly. Because of the redistricting, about a third of the members of both the House and the Senate are going to turn over this cycle because of retirements, because of people who are finally facing competitive elections for the first time, some of them in decades. And I think that's an opportunity for us to really start to inject more diversity of perspective into both bodies, but especially into the Senate. We have seen the incredible culture change that is taking place in the House in the post-Trump era, in the time that I've been elected. Fully half the House has turned over since Donald Trump became president. And that has meant a host of changes in the culture and the way of doing business in the House, especially on the Democratic side. We have the first majority woman caucus in Virginia history. We have so much more diversity on all the classic demographic markers on race and gender and region, but especially on professional perspective. The House now has all kinds of people who didn't look like politicians in the past. Our caucus has high school civics teachers and social workers and journalists and environmental engineers. We've got an economist, which I think is a good thing to have one of us in the room now and then. And I'm running for the state Senate because I think it's time to start doing to the Senate what we've done to the House. I think that the House now has this really wonderful, diverse and vibrant culture that has had this really important injection of new perspectives. And I do think that there is a chance to do that in the Senate as well now. And I think that would be a really good thing. I think in particular about the committee on which I would be most excited to serve in the Senate, on the Senate Commerce and Labor Committee, which controls not just the things you might think of as explicitly having to do with business, but all sorts of things that affect your daily lives, like workers and the wages you're paid or the health insurance that you get to have when you're in the hospital. The Senate Commerce and Labor Committee, on which you sit, has 15 members. There is one woman and there are no economists. And you think that affects the kind of bills that we pass about how people get paid, how they pay for their health care, about all sorts of things about the clean energy that we get in this community or not. And so I think it's really important that we start to diversify the Senate on all of those markers, on race, on region, on gender, and on professional perspective, because I think we could get a lot of good work done if we broaden the range of voices that's in the room.
And out of that committee, we passed Jennifer McClellan's Clean Economy Act in 2020. And this year we passed the bill that I co-patroned with Jennifer McClellan to the Affordable Energy Act to finally bring Dominion back within the grasp of the SEC. You know, in the beginning, I said that being an effective legislator is about two things: seniority and relationships. If my opponent has her way, She's given up her seniority in the House. You can give up the rest. She wants to give up your seniority in the Senate. Charlottesville will start at the back of the line in both places.
So we want to start at the back of the line. Your seniority transitions from the House to the Senate, and you would be coming in as that new wave of legislators. But I wrote the Affordable Energy Act 3 years ago, and we pushed it through the House, and it died in the Senate Commerce Committee. And it was only because we now have this shakeup in the General Assembly and a lot of people facing competitive elections now that you can no longer be on the wrong side of the Dominion issue and reliably get reelected. I don't think you did much more to the Affordable Energy Act but sign your name. Jennifer McClellan did the work on the Senate side.
You weren't involved in the negotiations. You weren't involved in the negotiations at all over there.
I have. for the
You
last-
showed up for the press conference and that's about it.
I wrote it 3 years ago, sir.
I don't believe that.
Use your time on this question. I'll be ready to make it hand up to our next one.
HB 1984 from the 2021 session.
So our next question is pretty brief. Where are you both getting the majority of your campaign funding? Starting with Delegate Hudson.
Nearly all of the campaign funds that are on my reports that we put out last time are from this district. I don't take money from corporations. And it's all from, at least, we'll see, we have to put together our reports for March, but I think now my memory's foggy, but it was north of 90% of the money that I raised on the report that we put out in December was from residents of this district, and not a dime was from corporations.
And I'm not independently wealthy. I take money from anybody anybody except Dominion or Appalachian that will donate money to my campaign can donate that money. And so I've not taken stock exactly what zip code all the money's come from.
We got a lot of questions about supporting urban renewal and revitalization in communities like Vinegar Hill. What can or should be done at the state level to support such efforts at revitalization locally?
Community revitalization, well, a lot of that depends, as we're going back to the housing issue specifically, but also about economic development. How do we develop economic opportunity in every community and impoverished communities? And that's an issue that we've been struggling with the whole time I've been there. Since I introduced the legislation in probably 1993 or 94 that created the Governor's Opportunity Fund, which is now the Commonwealth Opportunity Fund, to create grants for localities to grow businesses throughout Virginia. We need to think about how we do urban renewal to begin with. This isn't just a national thing. We need to think about from how we encourage the right sort of zoning and the right sort of development, so we can have retail opportunities for people. It's not good enough to just talk about affordable housing. Affordable housing also means that people are close to having economic opportunity close by. I remember when I was first elected to the Senate and did my first tour with Habitat for Humanity. Charlottesville Habitat for Humanity at that time was building houses in Buckingham County because that's the only place they could afford land. Well, it doesn't make sense to build houses in Buckingham County and have people have to drive back to Charlottesville to work. You've got to create economic opportunity right here. And so I think the state ought to be about looking through its tax policy and through its budget writing policy, looking for ways to fund projects that create urban renewal and opportunity in some of our older cities.
It's a great question. I think at any time we are looking for signs about how to do something right, it's best to look for models where it's been done well. And I think the best work on urban renewal that I've seen in Virginia has come from the other end of our congressional districts in Danville. We're actually really fortunate here at the University of Virginia that one of the directors of legislative affairs, Alexis Earhart, was steering the Chamber of Commerce in Danville when they were going through their massive economic redevelopment over the last decade. And I bet she's full of good ideas about how to do it well. And so that's why we're here today. I think about asking the people in Danville what they've done. And I don't have much sense of particular state measures that have made that possible. I think about outside of our community, especially in places like Danville or places like Nelson and Amherst elsewhere in this district. One of the most important things that we can do to support economic revitalization in towns is make sure they have the infrastructure that they need to run modern businesses. That's about continuing to roll out and oversee the deployment of federal funds, largely for broadband and for business ready sites, some of which we've got money in the state budget for this year. I think there's a lot that we can be doing at the local level to support workforce development in the kind of skilled trades that you need to support new businesses. I think particularly we've got Councilor Dee Dee Smith here. I'm thinking about the Go Virginia program, which has been so successful here in Charlottesville for a lot of enterprises that are now booming with restaurants and solar and construction and all sorts of good things. So, I'm certain that there are things that the state can be doing to better support that. Thus far, so much of that work has happened at the local level, in large part because the first big bottleneck is the zoning of the buildings.
And that is correct. I'll agree with Delegate Hudson on a whole lot of that. From a state standpoint, it's about providing the funding for so many things, whether it's grants or tax policy to create incentives to encourage that the right thing happens in some of these urban renewal projects. And Danville, the governor walked away from 3,500 jobs down there that would have further enhanced the economy in that area. And that's, we have to be thinking about that. We always have to be thinking about economic opportunity.
All right, on to our next question. Mental health services in Virginia and here in Charlottesville are both understaffed and underfunded. You have plans to open up more funding opportunities. If so, how would you build consensus?
First things first, I want to thank Senator Deeds for the work that he's done over especially the last decade, but for much of his career to elevate behavioral health care to the rightful place that it deserves in our priorities. And I think that you were uniquely able to do that in a way that other legislators couldn't, particularly as a rural white man. I think that it created opportunities to open conversations among communities where it was less comfortable talking about behavioral health care. You have moved that conversation into the mainstream so that Democrats and Republicans alike have embraced that work. And now I think that we can actually say that both Democrats and Republicans will tell you in some of their top talking points that they want to work on mental health care. I think that we're fortunate that many of the mental health proposals that were passed in the General Assembly this year had Republican patrons in the House and Democratic patrons in the Senate. I think that's in large part because the scale of the need knows no geographic bounds, that it's deep and it's wide and it's in every corner of Virginia. And so at this point, I think that the progress on behavioral health care in Virginia is less about mainstreaming it politically, which I think was the tail end of your question. And in large part, sort of gets back to where we are with school construction funding. It's how do you actually raise the funds to fund the positions that the workforce is crying out for. I do think that one important difference right now, at least between the House and the Senate in their perspective on how we handle behavioral health care, is that the House has on a bipartisan basis passed legislation that we've sent to the Senate to diversify the composition of the Behavioral Health Commission, to make it possible to have the clients of behavioral health services serving on the commission, because I think it's important to have those voices that are on the receiving end of the work that you do in the room when you're making decisions that affect them. That is not a proposal that has thus far passed through the Senate. And I do think that is sort of a difference, perhaps in the perspective that we may bring to this work. Is I tend to think that most services, we need both providers and clients at the table to talk to us about what's needed most. And I think that has been, at least thus far, a difference in perspective between us.
Well, first off, with respect to what Delegate Hudson was just talking about, all the inside baseball, Delegate Roxanne Robinson has carried that bill. I went to her office and sat down. We worked out a compromise on that legislation, and it did pass this session. It did pass. Everybody is in the room. But let's get back to the original question. 28% vacancy rate at our CSBs, our Medicaid reimbursements are so low that the providers are out of the game. We've got a statewide shortage of mental health providers. So this year, on top of what the governor proposed, he says it was a $230 million proposal, it was really only about $150 million for mental health. It was about $80 million for the developmental disability community. Important money, important, but you can't equate one group with the other. Two different groups of people that need help. On top of his 150, in the Senate budget, we put $170 million for mental health. And we devoted the bulk of that money to what we call building community capacity, giving our CSB workers a raise to try to draw people back into that profession. Raising the reimbursement rate for Medicaid so we could draw back our providers into the providing service to that important segment of our population. Increasing loan repayment funds and diversifying the people that are eligible for loan repayments, because we want providers to go to medically underserved areas. And you know what? If you look at a map of Virginia, where just about all of us live in an area that's medically underserved from a behavioral health standpoint. Everybody except Charlottesville and Northern Virginia. And frankly, right now, Norfolk, because we were able to recruit King Children's Hospital, the King's Daughters opened a new psychiatric hospital there, October 1 of last year. They've already recruited 19 pediatric psychiatrists. Count them. You know, you won't find 19 pediatric psychiatrists practicing in Virginia outside of that one spot. But we also put, like I said, $50 million into long-term supportive housing, because we know that as we try to transition people out of hospitals, they have to have a place to go. They have to have a place to go. And so we also create more internships, more residencies for psychiatric students, because we think we're putting people out of our medical schools, but we're not getting them to stay in Virginia. And candidly, if we can get people to stay here for a little while, to maybe find a spouse, maybe they will stay here. Maybe they'll serve Virginians. You know, we're doing everything we can think of, but we have so much more to do. You know, when I started this work in earnest about 10 years ago, I thought we could just move a few deck chairs around and add a few bucks. And what I found is we've been so chronically underfunded for such a long, long time that it's going to take years to get this right. But we can do it. We've got to do it.
This will be the last question from me tonight. It is for both of you. Have you personally met with members of the Buck Squad? If you support them, why? If not, why?
Yeah, I've been meeting with them for a couple of years now. And I think the last work that we tried to do together was when the grant funding became available from DCGS, the Department of Criminal Justice Service. Thank you. Grant funding that came available through Attorney General Mark Herring. There was specific funding for community-based violence interruption services that the Bucks on, you know, by name and purpose matched, and so worked with the city to apply for a grant to help secure some funding for them. So Buck Squad is one of the local folks that we've got that does violence interruption services. I know that we have others as well. I do think it's really important that we think about continuing to expand on the credible mentor kind of model, because if you're trying to figure out how do you find people who can help interrupt violence before it starts, it's important that those relationships are deeply rooted and come from people who have got credibility to engage with each other.
And here's the thing, the Democrats have one name for the grant funding, the Republicans have another, but it'll essentially do the same thing. We're working very hard to get some more grant funding in this year's budget. We just have to figure out what it's going to be called, how it's going to be awarded. But I've met with the members of the Buck Squad, and I plan on doing so again. I think we have to have community interrupters. We have to have people that are willing to stick their necks out to try to intervene and make sure that violence doesn't occur. There are other groups. I've met with other folks too, and I'm anxious to do it again.
Then we'll move on to our final question of the night. We have received a couple of questions concerning right to work, making joining unions optional and paying dues optional. Do you support a possible repeal? And if so, how would you do it?
Yes, I would have us split the House and the Senate and have Democrats do what we promised people on the campaign trail.
The right to work law has been part of Virginia's law since 1948. I don't think it's going to be very easy to repeal, you know, in 2020, when we had Democratic House and Democratic Senate, the repeal of the right to work didn't get out of the House of Delegates, and everything else in the world did. What I think that makes more sense is for us to pass legislation called fair share legislation to require people who don't choose to be members of the employee to pay their fair share for the union's representation for their work. That's what I've supported in the past.
I do think it's a stark difference between Virginia Democrats and Michigan Democrats. Michigan Democrats just got back a trifecta, and they put at the top of the list, codify Roe, universal background checks, repeal right to work. That was the loud and proud priorities at the top of the list.
In 2020, when we had a trifecta, the appetite of Democratic constituencies was ravenous. We worked from 7:30 in the morning till 7:30, 8:30, 9:30 at night. I carried 50 bills myself that year and got 30 some of them passed. There were a lot of bills, but that right to work bill didn't get out of the House of Delegates. My sense is that we're better to go with the fair share approach.
Next other question was about where we stand. I would also support fair share.
Can't hear.
Oh, I would just wanted to add that I would also support fair share legislation, but I just thought the question was whether we support right to work repeal.
We had another question or two come in from the audience. So Governor Youngkin has begun work to withdraw Virginia from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Will you fight that, and how?
You know, as I said, in response that, maybe I turned this off, I apologize. In December, we had a meeting of the Joint Commission on Administrative Rules, and we rebuked the governor, and that's pretty much to the extent of what we can do. We rebuked the governor and said, you've got to have legislative approval for this, because the legislature directed the Air Board to enter Reggie. The governor has a different point of view. His council has a different point of view. They have come at me pretty good, and I guess yes, I will fight him. I will continue to insist that we took the right position, but I think this is an issue that we're going to have to win in courts until we get a trifecta back.
Yeah, I think that's the short story. I think that most of the interpretations from legal folks have been that Virginia joined the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative by statute, and we can only withdraw by statute. The governor could test his theory that you could withdraw administratively in court, but I think he'll find out from a judge someday. I don't think the case is especially strong.
No.
And then for our actual last question. In 2021, Virginia repealed the ban on abortion coverage through exchange insurance plans. What were your roles in advancing this bill?
I carried it. I introduced it for the first time in 2020 and was surprised to have Democratic leaders tell me to pull the bill. It was a bill that would have expanded insurance coverage for abortion care purchased on our state health insurance exchange. It was one of the many barriers that Republicans had piled up to abortion access in the previous decade. I was surprised to learn that there was opposition from the administration to the bill, that they weren't ready to talk about not just what our abortion rights are in principle, but how we actually pay for abortion care if we need it. But that year I was a brand new legislator, I'd only been on the job for a few days. And so I decided to go with the flow from the administration and pull the bill. I brought it back in 2021 because I think it was an extra important priority that year. If you remember in 2021, we are now post-COVID, 1 in 6 Virginia workers had lost their job, and with it, a lot of them, their health insurance. And so more people than ever were purchasing insurance on the state health insurance exchange. That year, I was also encouraged that it would not be a priority, that we could take it up again after we expanded our majority in the House and won back the governor's mansion. And I didn't feel like that was going to happen. I thought our political window was closing. And so that year I decided to push the bill, got it passed House, Senate, signed by Governor Northam. I earned NARAL Virginia's award for Legislator of the Year that year for sticking with that project at a time when it was not widely popular. I do think it's important that we have legislators who are not just pro-choice, but legislators who are proactive in pursuing protections for abortion care. I think it's really important that we also have legislators who do that work rooted in contact with real clients. I didn't come up with that bill because a lobbyist dropped it on my desk. I had contacted that bill because I knew women who had run into that ban headfirst. And so I think it's really important. I think that's an example of what it means to let Virginia women fight for our rights on our own terms. I think it's different when we really lead the charge on that work ourselves.
I'm pro-choice, and over the last 32 years, I've seen hundreds of abortion bills introduced, most of them to limit a woman's right to choose. A woman's right to reproductive freedom is equivalent to her economic freedom. You know, I've being a white man, I've not thought it appropriate to introduce legislation about abortion because most of the bills that get introduced are introduced by white guys. And I've not introduced a bill. I'm proud of the fact that Virginia has probably certainly the most we protect reproductive freedom here more than any other state in the South. I'm proud in 2020 we repealed most of the Republican restrictions. I'm proud that we have the Roe v. Wade trimester-based analysis in the Code of Virginia. So a woman's right to choose is protected, but we're one vote away from that. A vote away from losing that. We've got to maintain the House. We've got to take back the House. We've got to maintain the Senate, and we've got to get a new governor who will sign even more bills.
I would just add at the end that I think it's really important that we have legislators who are not just willing to carry reproductive rights legislation, but also be willing to talk about it in public, because I don't think we're going to win back the broader culture war that secures our rights for the long haul if we are not proud, proactive advocates for abortion rights. And I know that especially, thank you, especially, in the wake of Governor Northam's political challenges around talking about abortion, I think a lot of Democrats have gotten cold feet about talking about abortion in public. It's easy to get tongue-tied. And I think that's why it's really important that we have legislators who are willing to do that work out loud in public, who don't get scared when it comes time to talk about abortion, because we won't get this work done without it.
Well, thank you both for joining us here tonight. If we can have a round of applause.
Thank you to all of you for coming out to grounds tonight to hear from us all. Just a reminder that voting begins on May 5th at your local registrar's office. If you'd like, you can follow the Center for Politics on social media at Center for Politics.
All right, and from Charlottesville Tomorrow, thank you very much for coming out tonight. Please subscribe to us at charlottesvilletomorrow.org so we can keep you informed on this race and everything else in your lives. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you very much, candidates, and you're all free to go. Last dismissed.
That's what I think.